The trailhead was quieter than I had expected for a Saturday morning. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on gravel and the distant murmur of a stream weaving through the forest. Mark adjusted his backpack, glancing at the map one last time before folding it and slipping it into his pocket. "This is going to be good for us," he said, not meeting my eyes. His tone carried a note of hope, but there was something beneath it, like he was trying to convince himself. I nodded, pulling the straps of my bag tighter over my shoulders. Yeah, fresh air, no phones, no work, just us and the trees. My voice sounded lighter than I felt. We had been planning this trip for weeks, framing it as a reset button for our marriage. After everything we'd been through, the silent meals, the arguments that flared up out of nowhere, it felt like we needed this. A break from the world and maybe a chance to find each other again. Or at least decide if we still wanted to. The trail began easily, winding gently into the dense, towering forest of Olympic National Park. I couldn't help but admire how ancient it all felt, as if we had stepped into a world untouched by time. Moss draped thickly over the branches of towering trees, like tattered green curtains, and the air smelled clean and earthy. For the first hour, we walked in comfortable silence, were broken only by the occasional snap of twigs underfoot or Mark's muttered directions. As we pushed deeper into the woods, I noticed how quiet it had become. Too quiet. The cheerful chirping of birds that had accompanied us earlier had vanished, replaced by a heavy, almost stifling stillness. Even the wind in the leaves seemed muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "Do you hear that?" I asked, stopping mid-step. Mark turned back to look at me, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" I opened my mouth to explain, but realized I wasn't sure what I'd been expecting to hear. "Nothing," I said, shaking my head. "It's just quiet." "Nature," he said with a small, teasing smile. "It's not supposed to sound like traffic." I forced a laugh and followed him, but the unease in my chest didn't ease. The trees seemed closer now, their branches stretching above us like skeletal arms. Shadows played tricks on my eyes, making me think I saw movement in the periphery, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. Around midday, we stopped to rest near a clearing. I dropped my pack onto the ground and took a long sip from my water bottle, watching as Mark studied the map. He was always so methodical, tracing our route with his finger and double-checking every landmark. "Everything okay?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally looked up, there was a slight crease between his eyebrows. "Yeah, just this clearing isn't on the map." I frowned and looked around. The area wasn't particularly remarkable, just a patch of open space surrounded by dense woods. But the grass here was oddly sparse, as though nothing could grow properly. In the middle of the clearing stood a single weathered stone pillar, its surface etched with markings I couldn't quite make out from where I sat. "Maybe the map's outdated," I offered, trying to sound casual. "Stuff like this probably isn't important enough to include." Mark nodded, but didn't look convinced. He folded the map and slipped it back into his pocket, his eyes lingering on the pillar. "Let's keep moving." As we packed up and continued down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching us. The sensation of eyes on my back grew stronger with each step, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. By late afternoon, the trail began to fade, the dirt path narrowing until it was little more than a faint indentation in the ground. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. Mark stopped abruptly, holding out a hand to signal me to do the same. "What is it?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to lower my voice. He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the forest ahead. "I think we're off the trail." The knot in my stomach tightened. "How?" "You've been checking the map constantly." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the sharp lines of his face. "I don't know, it just doesn't make sense." For the first time, I noticed how unfamiliar everything looked. The towering trees and dense undergrowth all seemed the same, an endless maze with no discernible landmarks. Panic began to bubble in my chest, but I pushed it down. "We'll figure it out," I said, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. "Let's backtrack a little." Mark nodded, but as we turned to retrace our steps, the air seemed to shift around us. The forest no longer felt like the serene escape we'd sought. It felt alive. The air was heavier now, thick with an unplaceable tension that made every breath feel like a chore. Mark walked ahead of me, his eyes scanning the ground as if searching for some sign of the trail we'd lost. But the forest wasn't cooperating. Every direction looked the same. Endless trees, shadows pooling like ink on the forest floor. "How far back do you think we should go?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. The oppressive silence of the woods seemed to demand it. Mark paused, glancing over his shoulder. His face was lined with frustration and something else, an unease that mirrored my own. "I don't know. It feels like we've been walking in circles." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the straps on my pack. The sun had dipped lower, its fading light bleeding through the canopy in weak, fragmented rays. But something about the light seemed off. It was dimmer than it should have been, like casting a strange orange hue over everything. As we pushed forward or backward, it was impossible to tell anymore. The forest grew denser. The path was gone now, replaced by uneven ground covered in tangled roots and ferns that clawed at our boots. I stumbled once, catching myself on a tree trunk. The bark was cold and damp under my fingers, but as I pulled my hand away, I noticed something carved into it, a jagged spiral that made my stomach churn. "Mark," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned, his brow furrowing as he approached. I pointed at the carving, and his expression darkened. "It's just a symbol," he said, but there was no conviction in his tone. I didn't argue. We kept walking, but the spirals began to appear everywhere. On trees, on rocks, even etched into the ground in places where the dirt was bare. Each one seemed sharper, deeper than the last, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them was becoming more desperate. By the time we stumbled upon the clearing again, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving the sky a sickly shade of gray. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. "It's the same place," I said, my voice trembling. "We've already been here." Mark didn't respond. He was staring at the stone pillar in the center of the clearing, his jaw tight. The strange markings on its surface seemed more distinct now, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Maybe we should," I began, but Mark was already moving toward it. "Mark, don't," I said, my voice sharp. "We don't know what that is." He ignored me, his hand brushing against the surface of the pillar. The moment his fingers made contact, a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground and up into my legs. I clutched a tree for balance, my eyes wide as the world around us seemed to shift. The forest blurred, its colors bleeding together like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The trees seemed to ripple, their shapes warping and twisting in ways that defied logic. And then the voices started. They weren't loud at first, just faint whispers like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, their tones both pleading and accusing. My chest tightened and I dropped to my knees, pressing my hands over my ears. "Emily!" Mark's voice cut through the cacophony, pulling me back. I looked up to see him standing by the pillar, his face pale and his eyes wide with something between terror and awe. "Did you see that?" "See what?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the whispers. "It was him," Mark said, his voice trembling. "It was Eric. I saw him." I stared at him, my stomach sinking. "Mark, that's not possible." He shook his head, his hands clenching into fists. "He was right there, Emily. He spoke to me. He said His voice broke, and he turned away, his shoulders heaving. Before I could respond, the humming intensified, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar. The spirals carved into the ground around us began to glow, casting an eerie light that painted the clearing in shades of green and gold. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing Mark's arm. "We need to go. Now." He didn't argue this time. Together, we ran back into the forest, the light from the clearing fading behind us, but the whispers followed, seeping into my mind, my memories. And no matter how far we ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that the forest had already claimed us. The forest didn't let up. The air pressed against us like a physical force, heavy with the echoes of those whispers. No matter how far we ran, the feeling that we were moving in circles gnawed at me. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. Neither could Mark, though I could see the fear and exhaustion etched into every line of his face. It wasn't long before the forest started to change again. The trees, which had once towered above us in natural chaos, now appeared unnaturally symmetrical, their trunks forming eerie, mirrored patterns that led in every direction. The ground beneath us shifted with each step like we were walking on something alive. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. We stopped to catch our breath, but I could still feel it. The forest was watching. "Mark," I gasped, gripping his arm. "What is happening? What was that thing back there?" He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the darkness between the trees. "It wasn't just Eric," he muttered finally. "I saw more. I saw the mountain, the ledge where I lost him. I felt—" He broke off, running a hand through his hair. "I felt it all over again." His voice cracked, and for a moment, he looked like he was about to collapse. I reached out to steady him. "We're gonna get out of this. We just need to keep moving." "Do you even know where we're going?" he snapped, pulling his arm away. His frustration boiled over, but beneath it, I could hear the tremor of panic. "Of course I don't!" I shot back, the words louder than I intended. "Do you think I understand any of this? The symbols, the whispers, the—" My voice faltered, and I forced myself to breathe. "We just have to keep going." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure. The whispers weren't just around us anymore. They were inside us, threading through my thoughts like vines. And then I started hearing it, her voice, Emily. It was faint, but unmistakable. My sister's voice, the one I hadn't heard in years, calling me from somewhere deeper in the forest. I froze, my blood turning to ice. "Mark," I whispered. "Do you hear that?" He turned to me, his face pale. "What? It's her. I hear her." My breath hitched as tears blurred my vision. "She's calling me." Mark's expression darkened. "That's not real, Emily. You know that's not real." But it felt real. Her voice sounded so close, so desperate. I took a step forward, then another, ignoring Mark's protests behind me. The forest blurred again, its shapes twisting and bending as if reacting to my movements. And then I saw her. My sister stood just ahead, her figure shimmering like a mirage in the dim light. She looked exactly as she had the last time I saw her, right before the crash. Her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a mix of sorrow and accusation. "You left me?" she said, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you save me?" Tears streamed down my face as I sank to my knees. "I'm sorry," I choked. "I'm so sorry." Behind me, I heard Mark shouting my name, but I couldn't move. The weight of guilt crushed me, pulling me deeper into the memory of that day, the screeching tires, the shattering glass, the silence that followed. But then I felt Mark's hands on my shoulders, shaking me violently. "Emily, it's not real. Look at me." I forced myself to meet his eyes, his face a mix of fear and determination. "This forest wants us broken," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "We have to fight it. We have to let it go." His words struck something in me, and for the first time I saw the truth. My sister wasn't real. She was a manifestation, a reflection of the guilt I'd carried for years. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe through the pain. "I'm sorry," I whispered again, but this time it wasn't for her. It was for me. When I opened my eyes, she was gone, the forest stilled, the whispers fading into a distant hum. Mark pulled me to my feet, his grip firm but gentle. "Now what?" I asked, my voice raw. He looked at me, his expression resolute. "We find our way out." The forest didn't make it easy. It twisted and fought against us, but step by step we pushed through. And when we finally broke through the tree line into the open air, the first rays of dawn lit the horizon. Behind us, the forest loomed, its secrets buried once more. But we didn't look back. We didn't need to. We had faced it and ourselves and survived. We arrived at the house just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the overgrown lawn. The Lockhart mansion looked every bit as old as the realtor had warned us, its weathered facade framed by gnarled trees that seemed to reach for the sky. The air smelled of damp wood and moss, and the creak of the front gate was the first sound to break the eerie silence. Michael stepped out of the car first, stretching and glancing back at me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Home sweet home," he said, his voice laced with an optimism I knew he didn't feel. I climbed out, smoothing the wrinkles from my jacket, and looked up at the house. It was bigger than I remembered from the photos, a hulking structure with narrow windows that seemed more like watchful eyes than architectural features. Lila bounded out of the back seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit and gazing at the house with wide-eyed curiosity. "Is this where the ghosts live?" she asked, her voice bright and innocent. "There are no ghosts," I said quickly, though the words tasted hollow even to me. "Just a little history, that's all." We carried our bags up the stone steps, each one groaning under our weight. The front door was stiff, as if it hadn't been opened in decades, and the smell of must hit me the moment we stepped inside. The foyer was enormous, with a grand staircase that spiraled upward into darkness. Dust hung in the air, catching the weak glow of Michael's flashlight. "Okay," Michael said, clapping his hands. "Let's get settled before it gets too late. Lila, pick a room upstairs. Emily, want to help me with the kitchen stuff?" I nodded and followed him toward the back of the house, but Lila lingered at the foot of the staircase. "What's behind that door?" she asked, pointing toward a heavy, boarded-up door at the end of the hall. Michael glanced at it briefly. "Probably just a storage closet. We'll check it out later." Something about the door didn't sit right with me, but I didn't say anything. We had too much to do, and my exhaustion from the move made it easy to dismiss the unease gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The first night passed uneventfully. We ate takeout on the living room floor and laughed about the quirks of the old house, the way the pipes rattled when the water ran, the uneven floors that made Lila's ball roll on its own. For a while, it felt normal. But then, I woke up around 3 a.m., my heart racing. At first, I thought it was the stress of the move, but then I heard it. A faint, muffled sound, like someone crying. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I sat up, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I glanced at Michael, who was still fast asleep, then at Lila's room down the hall. Everything was quiet again. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe a dream I hadn't fully shaken off. But the next morning, when I asked Lila how she'd slept, her answer chilled me. "I heard him," she said matter-of-factly, taking a bite of her cereal. "Heard who?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "The boy," she said, swinging her legs under the table. "He was crying. I think he's sad." I forced a laugh. "You probably just dreamed it, sweetheart." But Lila frowned, her small brow furrowed in confusion. "No, Mommy, he was real. He's behind the door upstairs." My stomach twisted, but I plastered on a smile and changed the subject. Michael seemed oblivious, absorbed in his coffee and his laptop, but the unease from the night before clung to me like a second skin. That afternoon, while Lila played in the yard and Michael set up his office, I found myself standing in front of the boarded-up door. The wood was old and splintered, and the boards seemed to have been nailed in place hastily, as though someone had been desperate to keep whatever was inside from getting out. I touched the door, half expecting it to feel hot or alive under my palm, but it was just wood. Normal, mundane wood. But as I stood there, the house seemed to hold its breath around me, the silence thick and heavy. When I stepped back, I thought I heard a faint knock from the other side. The knock haunted me for the rest of the day. I tried to brush it off, old wood settling, maybe a loose nail giving under pressure. Houses like this made noise, I told myself. It wasn't unusual. But the rationalization didn't hold, not really. Something about that door felt wrong, like it was daring me to come closer, to open it. I avoided it instead, sticking to chores and keeping busy, but the weight of it stayed with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. By the time evening rolled around, the house seemed darker than it should have been. The overhead lights flickered faintly, and the air felt colder, though the thermostat hadn't changed. Even Michael noticed it. "Did the heating system come with a side of ghosts?" he joked as he turned up the dial. I forced a laugh, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint sounds, scratching like nails on wood and the soft, rhythmic thud of something tapping. I lay there, counting the seconds between each noise until I finally sat up, unable to take it anymore. Michael stirred beside me, groaning softly. "You okay?" I hesitated. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He frowned, sitting up. "Hear what?" For a moment, the house was silent again. I almost thought I had imagined it, but then it came, soft, faint, but unmistakable. A child crying. Michael froze, his face pale in the moonlight spilling through the window. He didn't say anything, but his eyes darted toward the hall. "It's coming from upstairs," I said. My voice was barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would make the sound more real. Michael sighed, rubbing his face. Probably Lila having a bad dream. I'll check on her. He climbed out of bed and left the room, his footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors. I followed a few moments later, but when I peeked into Lila's room, she was sound asleep, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. Michael stood frozen in the hallway, staring toward the boarded-up door at the end. "It's not her," he said quietly, his voice hollow. It's coming from there." The crying stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost worse. It was too complete, too heavy. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until Michael turned to me, his expression unreadable. "We need to open it," he said. I shook my head instinctively. No way. Whatever's in there." "It's just a room," he interrupted, though his voice wavered. "We can't keep tiptoeing around it." The next morning, Michael brought his tools to the door. Lila sat at the base of the stairs, watching us with wide eyes. "Is the boy in there?" she asked softly. Michael paused, looking at her. "It's just an old room, sweetie. Probably empty. Nothing to worry about." Lila didn't respond, just hugged her rabbit tighter. The first swing of the hammer echoed through the house like a gunshot. Each blow sent splinters flying, the sound reverberating unnaturally, as though the house itself was protesting. When the last board fell away, the door stood bare, its handle tarnished and cold. Michael glanced at me, his hand hovering over it. I nodded reluctantly, and he turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, stagnant space. The air inside was icy, far colder than the rest of the house. A single window on the far wall let in a thin beam of pale light, illuminating the room's contents. A small bed, its frame rusted and bent, a scattering of broken toys, and deep, jagged scratches on the walls as if someone had been clawing to get out. Then we heard it again. The crying. Louder this time and unmistakably close. But the room was empty. Completely, impossibly empty. "Where is it coming from?" I whispered, stepping into the room despite the cold pricking at my skin. Michael followed, his face tight with unease. As soon as we were both inside, the door slammed shut behind us. The sound echoed like a thunderclap, and the beam of light from the window vanished, plunging us into darkness. The darkness was absolute, swallowing every shape, sound, and sense of orientation. I couldn't even see Michael beside me, though I could feel his presence. His ragged breathing matched my own. The air in the room had shifted, growing heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing closer. "Michael?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm here," he said, though his voice was tight with fear. "What the hell just happened?" Before I could answer, the crying returned. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was right there, surrounding us, echoing in every direction. It wasn't just the sound of a child's sobs anymore. It was layered, distorted, and wrong. It crawled into my ears, filling my head with static and despair. "We need to get out of here," I said, fumbling in the dark for the door. My hands found nothing but the icy smoothness of the walls. "The door! It's gone!" "Stay calm," Michael said, though I could hear the panic creeping into his voice. He tried the same, slapping his palms against the wall. "It was right here. It can't just..." His words were cut off by a sharp gasp. I spun toward him, but before I could speak, a faint, flickering light appeared in the center of the room. It wasn't natural. It shimmered like a broken projector, casting images onto the walls. At first, the images were vague, flashes of shapes and shadows. Then they sharpened into something terrifyingly familiar. My childhood home. The living room, to be precise. My mother was there, her face tight with anger, and my father was shouting. The memory played out exactly as I remembered, every detail seared into my mind. The shattering of the glass lamp, the slam of the door as my father stormed out, and my mother collapsing to the floor, crying. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "Not this." The room responded, the light flickering faster, and the walls seemed to warp, pulling me deeper into the scene. I wasn't just watching the memory, I was in it. I could smell the stale cigarettes, feel the scratchy carpet under my bare feet. My mother's sobs echoed around me, blending with the cries from the room. "Emily!" Michael's voice cut through the illusion, pulling me back to the freezing dark. His hand gripped mine, anchoring me, but his face was pale, his eyes wide. "It's doing it to me, too." "What do you see?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "A boy. The boy I..." His voice broke and he shook his head violently. It doesn't matter. None of this is real. The crying grew louder, deafening now, as if the room itself was screaming. The walls pulsed, the scratches growing deeper, carving themselves anew in jagged lines. A voice joined the chaos, a child's voice, angry and pleading all at once. "Why didn't you help me?" it demanded, a shrill accusation that pierced through the noise. "Oh, you left me here." I clutched Michael's arm, my breath hitching. "What does it want?" "I don't know," he said, his voice raw. "But we have to end this. We have to." He didn't finish. The light shifted again, and a figure appeared in the center of the room. A boy, no older than 8, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes hollow pits of black. He stared at us, unmoving, his presence radiating sorrow and rage. "You left me," he repeated, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You all leave." "We didn't," I started, but the words caught in my throat. How could I argue with a ghost? With a pain so raw it bled into the air around him? Michael stepped forward, his voice trembling but steady. "We're sorry for whatever happened to you. We're sorry, but we didn't know. We weren't here." The boy tilted his head as though considering this, but his expression didn't change. "You hide. You hurt. Just like them." The room shuddered violently, and I realized it wasn't about the boy, it was about us. The room fed on pain, on guilt, on the secrets we buried, and it wouldn't let us go until we confronted them. I grabbed Michael's hand and closed my eyes. "We're not leaving you," I said, not to the boy, but to the house itself, the force that held us. "We see you, we hear you, and we're sorry." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crying softened, the cold ebbed, and the walls stopped pulsing. The boy stared at us one last time before fading into the flickering light. The room went silent. When we opened our eyes, the door was back. Weak sunlight streamed through the cracks, and the air felt lighter. We stumbled out, shaking and silent, the house around us eerily still. But the door to the room slammed shut behind us, sealing itself once more. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. Whatever had happened there was over, at least for now. The air in Bayshore smelled of salt and decay, a mix of the ocean's tide and the aging wood of the docks. The town was small, quiet that felt more like apathy than peace. I had convinced myself that this would be the fresh start Sophie and I needed, but as I sat on the front steps of our little rental house, watching her draw shapes in the dirt, I felt a hollow kind of doubt. The house was simple, a worn, clapboard structure with faded shutters that flapped loosely in the wind. It sat just far enough from the shore to avoid the storms, but close enough for the low rumble of waves to be a constant backdrop. Sophie seemed to love it here, though. She had spent the last few days wandering the edges of the beach, collecting shells and smooth stones, her laughter carried by the wind. "Mom, why don't people come out at night?" she asked suddenly, her small hands paused mid-doodle. I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" she shrugged, glancing at the street behind us. "At school, they said no one goes to the beach after sunset. They said weird things happen." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice light. "Maybe they're just trying to scare the new girl." She didn't seem convinced. "Miss Annie from the diner said the same thing. She said people disappear." I sighed, brushing my hand over her hair. "It's just silly stories, Sophie. Nothing to worry about." But that night, as I lay awake listening to the tide's rhythm, her words lingered in my mind. Bayshore was undeniably odd. The villagers were polite but distant, their conversations stopping the moment I entered a room. At the cafe where I worked, I caught whispers about the figures more than once, though everyone seemed careful not to say too much. The beach itself, though beautiful in daylight, felt different after dark, cold, silent, as if the ocean was holding its breath. It was 2 days later when everything changed. I was making dinner, chopping vegetables, and humming along to Sophie's favorite song. The house was filled with the comforting hum of normalcy, a moment of reprieve from the unease that had shadowed me since we arrived. Then I called for Sophie. She didn't answer. I checked her room first. The window was open, the curtain fluttering in the breeze. Her bed was empty, her favorite stuffed bunny lying on the floor. A chill raced down my spine. I ran to the porch, scanning the street and yard. Nothing. "Sophie?" My voice cracked as I called her name again. No response. My chest tightened as I saw them, small footprints in the dirt leading away from the house toward the beach. I grabbed a flashlight and bolted, the cold night air slicing through my thin sweater. The beach stretched ahead, endless and dim under the fading light of dusk. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but it wasn't enough to calm the rising panic in my chest. And then I saw them. The figures stood motionless at the edge of the water, silhouetted against the weak glow of the moon. They were human-shaped but wrong, too tall, their forms shadowy and indistinct. They didn't move. They didn't speak. But I knew they were watching me. My voice faltered as I called Sophie's name again. The only answer was the sound of waves lapping against the shore. Something deep in my gut screamed at me to run, to go back to the safety of the house. But I couldn't. Somewhere out there was my daughter, and I would do anything to bring her back. The figures didn't move, but their presence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. I stood frozen, the beam of my flashlight shaking as I pointed it toward them. The closer I looked, the more impossible they seemed, features blurred as if they were smudged on glass, edges flickering faintly like a reflection in water. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I forced myself to step forward. "Sophie!" I shouted again, my voice barely carrying over the waves. No answer. The footprints in the sand led toward the water. My heart sank as I followed them, each step slower than the last. The figures remained still, their heads angled toward me, though I couldn't make out faces. Something about their silence was worse than if they'd spoken. It felt intentional, deliberate. The trail stopped just short of the tide. The ocean lapped softly at the sand, erasing the last hints of where Sophie might have gone. I searched desperately, swinging the flashlight across the water and back to the shore. Still nothing. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. Sophie's voice carried on the wind. "Mom," my breath caught, and I spun toward the sound. It came from further down the beach, closer to the cluster of figures. I hesitated, every instinct screaming that something was wrong, but her voice called again, fragile and trembling. "Mom, help!" I took a step forward, then another. My hands shook as I clutched the flashlight, the beam flickering as though it, too, was afraid. The figures didn't move, but the space between us felt smaller with every second, like they were stretching toward me without taking a step. "Sophie!" I yelled, but there was no response this time. Only the sound of the tide, steady and uncaring. The figures stood mere yards away now, and I could see them more clearly, or at least I thought I could. Their forms wavered, like heat rising off asphalt, but the edges of their silhouettes were sharp, unnatural. The air around them seemed denser, heavy with a salty metallic tang that burned my nose. I felt as though I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't stop. Not until I found her. "Where is she?" I demanded, though I didn't know who or what I was speaking to. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the weight of the night. One of the figures tilted its head, a motion so slow and deliberate it made my skin crawl. Then, for the first time, one of them moved. Not toward me, but toward the water. It walked into the tide without hesitation, disappearing beneath the surface as though it had been claimed. The others didn't react. They remained still, their invisible eyes fixed on me. The silence became unbearable, broken only by the crash of waves and the distant echo of Sophie's voice. I took another step, my feet sinking into the cold, wet sand. "I know you can hear me," I said, forcing steel into my voice. "Where's my daughter?" For a moment nothing happened, then a whisper, soft and fleeting, like the rustle of leaves. "She's here," it said. The voice was neither male nor female, neither close nor far, but it vibrated through my chest like a second heartbeat. "Where?" I shouted, my voice trembling with desperation. The figures remained still, but the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Closer than you think." My grip tightened on the flashlight as I scanned the beach again, frantic. "Sophie!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The tide surged higher, brushing against my ankles, and I felt it, a tug. Gentle at first, then insistent, like the ocean itself was reaching for me. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, but my eyes were drawn downward. The sand beneath my feet shifted unnaturally, small divots forming in the shape of footprints that weren't my own. They moved toward the water, as though something unseen was walking back into the sea. I froze, my mind racing. Sophie's voice whispered again, faint but close, too close. "Mom here." Her voice wrapped around me, soft and fragile, but close enough to feel like a hand tugging at my sleeve. I spun in every direction, the flashlight's beam darting across the sand and water. Nothing. The figures still loomed at the water's edge, their unmoving forms like sentinels watching a ritual unfold. "Sophie!" I shouted, my voice raw. "Where are you?" "Here." The whisper came again, threading through the crashing waves. This time, it sounded wrong. There was something in it, a distortion, like a voice played backward. My chest tightened as cold realization dawned on me. This wasn't Sophie, at least not entirely. The tide surged higher, pulling at my feet, almost as if it were alive. I stumbled back onto the dry sand, my breaths shallow and quick. The figures remained still, but I felt their presence pressing against me, as though the air between us had thickened. The cold gnawed at my skin, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot by a mix of terror and desperation. "Sophie," I whispered, my throat tight. "If you're here, I'll find you. I promise." The figures turned in unison. The movement was slow, deliberate, and impossibly silent. Their heads tilted toward me, their faces, or the absence of them, seeming to lock onto my very soul. Very soul. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grip and plunging the beach into near darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrambled to pick it up, the sand cold and damp under my hands. Then I saw her. Sophie stood at the edge of the water, her small frame silhouetted by the weak light of the moon. She looked fragile, like a doll left in the rain too long. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands, and her clothes were soaked, hanging heavily on her thin frame. "Sophie!" I surged forward, the relief crashing into me like the tide itself. But something about her stopped me in my tracks. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her head tilted slightly, and I realized with a jolt that her expression was blank. Too blank. Like she was staring through me, not at me. Her lips parted, and the whisper came again, this time louder, echoing all around. "Closer than you think." My stomach dropped as her voice overlapped with another, deeper one. I froze, unable to reconcile the child in front of me with the thing speaking through her. "Sophie," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's me, honey. It's Mom." Her head tilted further, almost unnaturally so, and then she smiled. A cold, hollow smile that didn't belong on her face. The figures behind her moved closer, their shapes stretching unnaturally, as if the distance between us didn't obey normal rules. "You came," she, or it, said, the words vibrating through the air like the low hum of an earthquake. "We've been waiting for you." I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. "Let her go," I said, my voice trembling but louder this time. "Whatever you are, let her go." The figure stopped. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe, but the moment didn't last. Sophie, or the thing wearing her face, raised a hand and pointed toward the ocean. "You can have her," the voice said, colder than the wind slicing across the beach. "If you give yourself." I froze, the weight of the words crashing over me. The pull of the tide at my feet grew stronger, almost as if the ocean itself was hungry. My mind raced, but my body was rooted in place. Sophie's face flickered like an image on a glitching screen, and for a split second I thought I saw her real eyes behind the hollow facade, pleading, terrified. "Mom." This time, it was her. I was sure of it. I didn't think. I ran toward her, plunging into the icy water as it rose to my knees, then my waist. The figures didn't stop me, but they didn't need to. The cold clawed at my limbs, making every step harder. When I reached Sophie, I grabbed her, pulling her into my arms. Her body was so cold, so impossibly heavy, but she was there, real, solid. The figures loomed closer, their forms merging with the waves. The tide rose higher, threatening to drag us both under. "Hold on to me," I screamed, clutching her tightly. The water surged around us, but I pushed against it, dragging her back toward the shore. Each step felt like wading through concrete. But the beach grew closer, the figures retreating into the depths. When we collapsed onto the sand, the night fell silent. Sophie's small body trembled in my arms, her breaths shallow but steady. I held her, my tears soaking into her hair, and whispered over and over that she was safe. But as I looked up, the figures still watched from the waves, their outlines barely visible against the horizon. They didn't follow us, but I knew this wasn't over. I woke up to the sterile smell of disinfectant and the hum of fluorescent lights. My eyelids felt heavy as if they'd been glued shut, and when I finally managed to force them open, I saw a white ceiling open. I saw a white ceiling above me. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, or maybe still asleep. Hospitals weren't supposed to be this quiet. I sat up slowly, my body protesting with stiff joints and an ache in my chest I couldn't explain. The bed was standard hospital fare: thin mattress, rough sheets, rails on the sides. There was a monitor beside me, its screen blank, wires trailing down to the floor. I glanced at my arms but saw no IVs, no bandages. I didn't feel sick or injured. So why was I here? Hello? My voice sounded rough, like I hadn't used it in days. There was no response. I pressed the call button on the bedside panel, but nothing happened. No nurse rushing in, no sound at all. The silence was wrong, too complete, like the world outside had disappeared. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, the cold tile floor shocking against my bare feet. My hospital gown crinkled as I stood, and I felt a faint dizziness as I steadied myself. The room was bland, indistinguishable from 1,000 others like it. Pale walls, a single window with the blinds half drawn. I went to the window, expecting to see a parking lot or a city skyline, but when I pulled the cord, there was nothing outside. Just gray, like fog, but thicker, heavier. It pressed against the glass, refusing to let me see further. "Where am I?" I muttered, the panic beginning to creep into my chest. I turned to the door. It was ajar, revealing a sliver of a dimly lit hallway. The light overhead flickered intermittently, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a shadow moving just out of sight. But when I stepped closer, there was nothing there. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. Rows of identical doors lined the walls, each with a small metal plate for a room number. I looked back at my own door and froze. The plate was blank, as if someone had forgotten to assign it a number. I stepped into the corridor, my bare feet padding softly against the polished floor. The further I walked, the more the silence felt oppressive. It wasn't just quiet, it was like the world itself had been muted. My breath echoed in my ears, and I had the unsettling sensation that I wasn't alone, though I couldn't see anyone. The first door I tried was locked, so was the second. The third opened easily, but the room inside wasn't another hospital room. It was my old office. I blinked, stepping inside cautiously. The room was impossibly accurate, every detail exactly as I remembered it. The gray carpet, the fake potted plant in the corner, the outdated computer humming softly on the desk. Even the framed photo of my daughter sat where it always had, slightly crooked. "What the hell?" I whispered, touching the desk. It felt real, solid. But how could it be here? The sound of voices caught my attention, and I turned to see two figures standing in the corner. One was me, dressed in the same suit I used to wear to work, holding a piece of paper with a grim expression. The other was James, the colleague I had fired 3 years ago. I watched, frozen, as the scene played out. "You're letting me go?" James asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. "It's just business," my past self replied coldly, avoiding his gaze. "We're downsizing." "You recommended me for this job," James said, his voice rising. "I moved my family across the country because you said it was a good opportunity." The memory was so vivid, it felt like I was reliving it. I had avoided thinking about this moment for years, brushing it off as something I had to do to save my own career. But now, seeing the pain on James's face, I felt it in a way I never had before, sharp and unrelenting, like a blade cutting into my chest. When the scene ended, the room began to dissolve around me. The walls faded, leaving me standing alone in the empty hallway once again. But now the silence felt different, heavier, and the next door down the corridor was already open, waiting for me. The open door seemed to beckon me, its darkness spilling out into the hallway. I didn't want to go inside, but the thought of staying in the empty corridor with its endless silence was worse. My feet moved on their own, drawing me closer until I crossed the threshold. At first, I couldn't see anything. The air felt colder here, heavier, like the room was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the shadows lifted, and I saw where I was, my childhood bedroom. The bed was smaller than I remembered, covered with the same faded blue comforter with rocket ships I'd had as a boy. The wallpaper, peeling at the edges, was adorned with cartoon astronauts, frozen mid-flight in their cartoonish spacesuits. A familiar knot formed in my chest. This wasn't just a recreation, it was my room, exactly as it had been when I was 8 years old. "Why here?" I murmured, my voice shaking. The air shifted, a soft creak breaking the stillness. My breath hitched as I turned toward the closet. The door was ajar and a faint light spilled out, flickering like a dying bulb. My instincts screamed at me not to go near it, but I couldn't stop. Something inside demanded my attention, and my feet obeyed. As I approached, the flickering light stabilized, and I saw what was inside. A younger version of myself, sitting cross-legged on the floor. He was staring at an old shoebox in his lap, his expression blank, but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Ethan?" I whispered. The boy didn't respond. He simply opened the shoebox, and I saw what was inside. An old photo of my parents, smiling and carefree, taken before the divorce. Beneath it were crumpled papers covered in messy handwriting. I recognized them immediately. Letters I had written to my father after he left. Letters I never sent. The boy picked up one of the letters and began to read aloud, his voice trembling with emotion. "Dear Dad, why don't you come home? Did I do something wrong? Mom says it's not my fault, but it feels like it is." "Stop," I said, my voice cracking. "Please, stop." He didn't listen. He kept reading, each word cutting deeper. I had forgotten about those letters, buried them with all the other memories I didn't want to face. But now, hearing them again, I felt the weight of every unanswered question, every moment of self-blame I had carried into adulthood. The boy's voice grew louder, almost accusing, until the closet door slammed shut, silencing him. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. The walls seemed to close in, the cartoon astronauts distorting into grotesque shapes. I clutched my chest, gasping for air, as the shadows swallowed the room. When the light returned, I was back in the hallway. My legs felt weak, but the door to the next room was already open, waiting. I tried to steel myself, telling myself that whatever was inside couldn't be worse than what I'd just seen. But I was wrong. The next room wasn't a place I recognized. It was a hospital room, stark and clinical, with a single bed in the center. A woman lay on the bed, her face turned away from me. My stomach twisted as I approached, each step heavier than the last. "Mom?" I whispered. She didn't move. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, the sound of the ventilator filling the space. The memory hit me like a freight train, the last time I had seen her alive, hooked up to machines, her frail body barely clinging to life. I reached out to touch her hand, but she spoke before I could. "You weren't there." Her voice was weak but sharp, cutting through the air like glass. I froze, my hand hovering above hers. "I waited," she said, her voice trembling, "but you didn't come." "I'm sorry," I choked, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know it would be the last time. The room darkened, her form fading into shadow as the words echoed around me. "You weren't there." The walls began to crack, splitting apart as the room dissolved into nothingness. I fell to my knees, the guilt crashing over me like a wave. When I looked up, I was back in the corridor, the next door standing wide open. The next door loomed larger than the others, its edges glowing faintly as if beckoning me forward. My legs felt leaden, my chest tight, but the silence of the hallway gave me no solace. Each step toward the door felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the memories I'd already faced was dragging me down. When I crossed the threshold, the light in the room flickered violently before settling. I stood in the middle of a highway at night, surrounded by the empty expanse of asphalt and the hum of insects in the humid air. The headlights of a car illuminated the road ahead, its engine idling. The scene was painfully familiar. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Not this." I turned, hoping to find the door back to the hallway, but it was gone. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, shrouded in shadows. The car behind me flashed its headlights twice, and the memory hit me with brutal clarity. It was the night of the accident, the night everything changed. The driver's side door opened, and I saw myself step out. A version of me from just a few weeks ago, wearing the same jacket I'd left the house in. He, or I, was holding a phone, the glow of the screen casting an eerie light on my face. The headlights of an oncoming car appeared in the distance, growing brighter and faster. "Stop!" I shouted, running toward the scene, but my feet didn't move fast enough. It was like running through water, every step slower than the last. The other me didn't hear, didn't look up. The phone buzzed in his hand and he looked down to read a message. The headlights grew brighter, closer, until they were blinding. "No!" I screamed, my voice breaking as the cars collided with a deafening crash. The sound was all-encompassing, shaking the ground beneath me. When I opened my eyes, the wreckage lay before me. twisted metal and shattered glass glinting under the moonlight. I could barely breathe as I approached, the scene frozen in brutal clarity. Inside the wrecked car, I saw her, my daughter's face pale and motionless, her small body slumped in the passenger seat. My knees buckled and I collapsed beside the wreckage, the weight of my guilt crushing me. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean it." The air around me shifted, and a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was the nurse, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. "You weren't looking," she said simply. "You weren't there for her." Her words cut through me, sharper than any blade. "I tried," I began, but she interrupted. "You ignored the warnings," she said, "and now you're here." The highway faded, leaving me standing in a blank, featureless room. The nurse gestured toward a door that had appeared in the wall, its surface smooth and unmarked. "This is the last one," she said. "It's time to decide." "What's behind it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Closure," she replied, "or oblivion. You've seen the truth. You've faced your choices. Now you must choose how it ends." My heart pounded as I stepped toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The memories of the hospital, the letters, the accident, they all swirled in my mind, each one a weight I could barely carry. I didn't know if I deserved closure. I didn't know if I could forgive myself. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I turned the handle and the door opened to a blinding light. It enveloped me, warm and overwhelming, until the emptiness was replaced with a feeling I hadn't expected: peace. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the hospital room where it all began. The hallway was gone, the doors gone, and the monitor beside me beeped steadily. I wasn't sure if I was alive or dead, but for the first time in years, the weight on my chest was gone. The last thing I saw before the room faded was the nurse, standing silently by the window, her face serene. Then everything went still, and I knew my journey was over. The late afternoon sun bathed Haven Springs in a warm, golden light, the kind that made everything seem just a little more peaceful than it actually was. I watched from the window of my small music classroom as students filed out of the school, their laughter and chatter carrying faintly on the breeze. It was a comforting sound, familiar. Yet, something about today felt off. "Miss Carter?" A voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned to see one of my students, Lily Jacobs, standing by the door with her violin case clutched tightly in her hands. Her brow was furrowed, her usual bright smile nowhere to be found. "Yes, Lily?" I asked, forcing a warm tone into my voice. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the handle of the case. "Do you know anything about weird music?" The question caught me off guard. "Weird music?" I echoed. "What do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be standing there. "It started playing on my phone last night," she said. "I wasn't even using it. It just came on by itself. It was strange." "What kind of strange?" I asked, leaning forward slightly. Lily shook her head. "I don't know. It wasn't like anything I've ever heard, and then I saw..." Her voice trailed off and she looked down, her knuckles white against the black case. "Never mind. It's probably nothing." Before I could press further, she mumbled a quick goodbye and slipped out of the room, leaving me with an uneasy feeling that settled deep in my chest. That night, as I sat in my living room grading papers, I couldn't stop thinking about what Lily had said. The way her voice wavered, the way she refused to look me in the eye. It wasn't nothing. And then there was Josh, my brother, who had called me earlier that morning about something strange happening with his garage radio. It was just static at first, he'd said, but then there was this music, and Anna, I saw things. Bad things. At the time, I'd brushed it off as Josh being dramatic. He always had a flair for the theatrical, and I figured he was just trying to get a rise out of me. But now, with Lily's words echoing in my mind, I wasn't so sure. I was about to call Josh back when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up with his name, and a wave of relief washed over me. Maybe he'd decided to explain more. "Josh?" I said, picking up, but there was no response, only silence on the other end. "Josh, are you there?" I asked again, and then I heard it. A faint melody, soft and haunting, crackling through the line like it was being transmitted from a long-forgotten radio station. The notes were uneven, discordant, and yet somehow hypnotic. I felt my pulse quicken as I strained to make out the faint whispers beneath the music, words that didn't make sense but filled me with a growing sense of dread. "Josh!" I shouted, gripping the phone tighter. The music abruptly cut out and the line went dead. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, my own reflection looking back at me in the dim light. I wanted to believe it was just a technical glitch, a coincidence, but deep down I knew better. The music was real, and it had found me. I couldn't sleep that night. The melody from the phone call lingered in my mind, looping endlessly like a broken record. It was strange how a few scattered notes could feel so heavy, so intrusive, like they had burrowed into my thoughts and refused to leave. By the time the sun rose, I had convinced myself to check on Josh. His house wasn't far, a 10-minute drive across town. Haven Springs was small enough that I could cross it end to end in less than 15 minutes, but the distance felt heavier today. The streets were unusually quiet for a Saturday morning, with most of the shops along Main Street still shuttered, their closed signs swaying gently in the breeze. Josh's truck was in the driveway when I arrived, but the house felt wrong. The curtains were drawn, and the front door, usually slightly ajar from his carelessness, was shut tight. I knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. "Josh, it's me," I called, my voice breaking the silence. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. "Josh, come on, open up." When he didn't respond, I tried the handle. It was unlocked. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside, immediately greeted by the faint hum of static coming from the kitchen. My stomach turned as I followed the sound, my footsteps soft against the creaky wooden floor. The radio on his counter was on, but the dial was turned all the way to the left, resting between stations. I reached for it, but the static crackled louder, almost like a warning. Before I could touch it, the static shifted, and that same melody from the phone call emerged, quiet at first, but growing louder with each second. "Josh," I called again, my voice trembling. Then I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the garage. I turned toward the door leading to it, my heart pounding. Slowly, I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The garage was dark, the only light coming from a small window near the ceiling. Josh was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, staring at something in his hands. "Josh!" I rushed to him, kneeling beside him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing me. In his hands was a notebook, the pages filled with frantic, messy writing. "Josh, what's going on? Talk to me." I grabbed his shoulders, shaking him lightly. He blinked, his gaze snapping to mine as if he'd only just realized I was there. "Anna," his voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "It's everywhere. The music. It doesn't stop." "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "What happened?" He shoved the notebook into my hands, his fingers trembling. I wrote it down, everything I saw. Flipping through the pages, I was met with disjointed phrases and chilling sketches. Dark figures with hollow faces, shadows reaching out from unseen corners, words like, "they know" and "don't listen," scrawled over and over again. My chest tightened as I turned to the last page, where a crude drawing of me stared back, my face distorted into something monstrous. "I saw you," Josh whispered. "In the visions, but it wasn't you." Before I could respond, the melody surged through the house, louder and more erratic, as if it were alive. Josh screamed, covering his ears, his body curling in on itself. I tried to block out the sound, to pull him away from it, but it was everywhere, coming from the radio, the walls, the air itself. Desperate, I yanked the plug of the radio from the socket. The music cut off instantly, leaving a silence so deep it was almost suffocating. Josh was trembling. His breath ragged as he rocked back and forth. "It's not just the music," he muttered, his voice shaking. "It's what it shows you. It knows everything, Anna, about you, about everyone." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. The music had a purpose, and it was only just beginning. I left Josh at his house, locked inside with the radio unplugged and the notebook clutched tightly in his hands. He refused to come with me, muttering about how the music would find him anyway. His words stuck with me as I drove to Ethan's place, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Whatever this music was, it wasn't just sound. It was alive, and it knew us. Ethan's apartment was a mess when I arrived. His computers were scattered across the dining table, wires tangled and monitors glowing faintly in the dim room. He barely looked up as I walked in, his eyes bloodshot and focused on a string of codes scrolling across one of the screens. "You're late," he said, his voice flat. "Josh is worse," I replied, dropping into the chair opposite him. "He's hearing it everywhere. I don't know how much longer he can take it." Ethan finally looked at me, his expression grim. "We don't have much time. The signal is spreading." "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach sinking. He turned the monitor toward me, showing a map of Haven Springs. Glowing red dots were scattered across it, each one pulsing faintly. "These are devices I've tracked playing the music. It started with just a few. The radio, some phones. Now it's spreading to anything that can produce sound. TVs, baby monitors, even toys." I stared at the map, the sheer number of dots making my chest tighten. "What's causing it?" Ethan hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. "I think it's using the devices as a medium. It's not coming from a radio station or a server. It's something else, something alive." His words mirrored Josh's, and the weight of it settled over me like a shroud. "Can we stop it?" I asked. "I think so," he said, though his tone didn't sound confident. "The signal is strongest near the old radio tower outside town. If we can cut it off there, maybe we can stop it from spreading." The drive to the tower was silent, the air between us thick with unspoken fear. The road wound through the woods, the trees casting long, jagged shadows under the pale moonlight. When we reached the clearing, the tower loomed over us, its rusted frame creaking faintly in the wind. The melody started before we even stepped out of the car. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. I felt it curl around my thoughts, tugging at memories I'd buried long ago. I shook my head, trying to focus, as Ethan pulled a crowbar from the trunk. "We'll destroy the equipment," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever's up there, we can't let it keep broadcasting." We climbed the narrow staircase inside the tower, each step echoing like a heartbeat. The music grew louder the higher we went, filling the space with its haunting, discordant notes. By the time we reached the top, it was deafening. The room at the top of the tower was small, cluttered with outdated equipment that shouldn't have been working. But the machines buzzed with unnatural energy, their dials spinning erratically. In the center of the room was a speaker, its cone vibrating as the music poured out, alive and malevolent. "It's here," Ethan muttered, stepping toward the equipment. "It's coming from this." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not the machines, it's in the music." The room pulsed with light as the music reached a crescendo. Visions exploded in my mind. Josh's face twisted in fear, the faces of neighbors I hadn't seen in years, all staring at me with accusations in their eyes. It wasn't just showing secrets anymore. It was feeding off them, growing stronger with every ounce of fear it created. "Ethan!" I screamed, snapping him out of his trance. "Destroy it!" He swung the crowbar, smashing the speaker with a force that shook the room. The sound warped, then cut off abruptly, leaving an aching silence in its wake. The equipment sparked and died, the room dimming as the power drained away. We stumbled back down the stairs, the oppressive weight of the music finally lifting. But as we stepped outside, I felt a faint vibration in my pocket. Pulling out my phone, I saw a notification. "Play next, unknown track." The silence wasn't victory, it was waiting.